It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Hello, America. This is President Geiger, Republic 4 of the United States of America. And I have with me today Justice Waters, that you've heard quite often on the radio, and also a special guest, Gill Broussard, who's also appeared on the radio with us a couple of times in the past. Gill is here to give us an update on current events and how the passing of this planet may be related to what's going on that maybe you need to give some thought to. That being said, Gill, one of the things you had mentioned to me earlier was the fact that the troops that had been invited to D.C., the National Guard, you had heard through channels that they were invited to stay there 30 days. What in the world would that have to do with anything to do with the planet passing? I'll turn the floor over to you.
New president was inaugurated around 11 o'clock yesterday. And if you add 30 days to that, well, that puts us on February 20th. Well, February 20th is the day that I've been saying for the last 5 or 6 years that it's the warning date, that they'll give you only a 40-day warning, similar to Jonah giving the warning to Nineveh, that they only had 40 days. And I also stated that before this planet would come around, we'd see the military in the street, pretty much globally in most of the larger countries, like the G20. Some of the smallest countries will also do it because they'll have probably violence in the streets as it gets closer. But this is too eerily similar to what I said in the past.
Thank you, Gill. You were explaining to me, I thought it was quite appropriate to what's going on right now about the kings in Europe and what they used to do during times of trouble. Can you explain that to the American people?
Yes. For a period of time when the astronomers would tell them that, remember, all emperors and many of the kings of the past throughout different cultures had their own astronomers for the royal household. Basically, they were looking for this turn of this very large comet, the planet-sized comet. That's what you've heard the name of Planet-X thrown around. You heard the names of Nibiru. There's probably about close to 80 different names that's given to this intruder comet that comes around. And it causes massive problems for the whole Earth. You have the drought. You see massive weather changes, death in birds and sea life. You see volcanoes going up in a exponential growth around the world as far as the amount of, the frequency of them, and the intensity is greater. The same thing is happening with the earthquakes globally. This is all normal for an approaching planet. If any one of these alone would be fine, but it's not. It's all going on at the same time on all of these fronts. That has to be an object that is affecting us. But they used to switch over the king with the temporary king, okay? And the real king would be in the background, letting this temporary king rule the kingdom for a while, and he would get all of the negative stuff on all of the problems of the community, which is dealing with this causes of this planet, whether there's drought, famine, quakes, you name it, everything, floods. And then once the time period, which is you got 3.5 years coming in and 3.5 years leaving, with the peak happening at the crossing whenever this planet comes around. Well, that's when the king would take back his throne after that, when things are starting to, decline. They'd usually either execute the prior temporary king or whatever. This is almost similar in a way. Here comes a Biden that's going to get a lot of the negative stuff, and he's just a temporary king. And then there's 30 days for the troops to be there in Washington. Keep in mind they're going to slack the numbers down to about 6,500 and hold it there, but they're not taking down the fences or anything. And they're there for 30 days. And that brings us to the 40-day warning time period of February 20th. Remember, we have not had a valid sighting, but around February 10th, according to the orbital path that we are estimating, it should go behind the sun at that time. And in between the 10th and the 20th, the tail should be popping out the other side of it. it will start off like a medium comet. But as it gets closer, the tail is going to stretch from the east to the west. It's the biggest comet in history. This has passed multiple times in the past, about every 360 years, not 3,600 years, like some people are saying, which is false information. It appears that we have quite a few things lining up. We still need a valid sighting, and we won't get that closer to either prior to February 20th. So people should be looking at the sunset. When the sun is setting, towards the end, you start to see a comet tail pointing out to the upper left region of the sun after the sun is setting. And that would be the tail, it's the beginning of it. It's to expect martial law to stay till quite a while after this event is over. This is one of the reasons why they're going to go to a digital currency where it's asset-backed, because they don't want to go on the ground with fiat currency, because when they come out, it's going to be worthless. But digital currency, which is asset-backed, would be similar to owning the titles to minerals of a nation. This is all in the making right now. This is also equivalent to the 20 years of Jacob's trouble. Jacob's trouble started in 2001. That was the beginning of the sixth millennium. Jacob's trouble goes on to 20 years, because you can read the story of Jacob. We have quite a few parameters that are lining up. That gives me great concern, and that concern should be also reflected by other people.
Thank you, Gill. And I know that people will have questions about the beginning of Jacob's trouble. Can you explain a little bit more about that, how that came about? It was announced in Jerusalem by all the different factions of rabbis, was it not?
Yes, it was. But I don't only rely on that. Remember, you have to back check things. I have it right here. It's on March 29th of 2001. It was announced at the Wailing Wall. It says, twice during the week, a large contingency of Sephardic and Ashkenazi rabbis met at the wall to announce the time of Jacob's trouble has begun. The biblical Hebrew year of 6001 marks the first year of the seventh millennium of Jacob's prophecy about Judah and the constellation we know as Leo. So if we take this for the statement, now keep in mind they had to retract this 2 weeks later, because they're not allowed to switch back to the biblical calendar unless they have a high priest that says the old one is done away with. And they can't have a high priest unless they have a temple. So they're basically caught in their man-made laws right here, because they were never supposed to change to this calendar that they're following anyway. So through my research using astronomy, we have about 7 or 8 different reference points that with ancient artifacts that gives us exact dates when certain events occurred in the Bible, because the artifacts give us enough stars and planets to where we can give you an event within 3 hours of the actual event. So what I had found out is that the patriarchs' ages in most of our Bibles have been altered, even in the Orthodox text. And the Christian side has a different reason for altering them versus the rabbis. The rabbis alter them because they didn't want their followers to know more than they did as far as the timing. So they have a separate book called the Book of Genealogy that only the head rabbis are able to look at. Okay, so we don't have access to that. But we do have access to God's calendar, which is astronomy. Now, the Christian Bibles were edited from the Greek and the Latin during the Dark Ages, when so many people were dying and the church was being basically persecuted for why are our prayers not answered? Why are we going through this? Why is a third of Europe dying? Well, what they did was to change the patriarch ages to show that they were in the end times. They added about 300 years to it. And the way they did that, they added 100 years to some of the ages. So I had to do a search to find out what Bible would line up with the events of the patriarchs. That way it would qualify the ages. and there was only one left that is in the museum in Leningrad. It's called the Leningrad Codex. And that verified the same dates as what they're talking about. March 29th of 2001 was year 6001. So we are definitely in Jacob's trouble. And if you read Jacob's story, his brides are paralleling. Think of Jacob as the Messiah for the shadow picture, and his brides are acting as world leaders. Jacob had to work 7 years for his first bride, okay? What you end up getting is Leah, which was a bride he didn't know he was getting. He was tricked, and he knew nothing about her. Well, remember, Bush's term started in year 2000, so from 2001 he had 7 years after that. And then we get Mr. Obama. Well, Mr. Obama went for 7 years, but then we had a jubilee in year 2016, so that makes it 8 years. Then the contract for 7 years can start again. Now, Jacob worked for another 7 years for his true bride, which was Rachel. You see, Mr. Obama, many people had a lot of great hopes that he was going to go after the deep state and change things, but he was working for them, actually. He was the globalist and the communist, and Islam is plotting against the seed of Jacob. That's Jacob's trouble. That started in 2001. Now we have the right bride that we won, which was Trump, and he's going against the deep state. And then after that, remember, he had the bridesmaids, 2 of them. Not the bridesmaids, the maidservants of the 2 wives that he had children with. Okay? That's basically adding up to Biden and Kamala Harris. So this is a shadow picture. And that goes on for 20 years, which is this is the last year of the 20. And from this last March, remember, we saw seal 1 and 2 start in 2001. A general declared war on the non-Islamic nations. That started in 2001. Then we had 9/11, which is seal 2, pieces taken from the earth. Now this last March, seal 3, 4, and 5 has started. And it won't be completed until March of this next coming year. Seal 3 was global economic problems. We've seen that. We've seen a global economy partially shut down. It's going to get much worse. Seal 4 talks about pandemic and plagues, and it also talks about war and 1/4 of the world population dying. Okay? Part of that prophecy has not been fulfilled yet. We're fixing to go into a major war, probably with China and India and Pakistan. You're going to see a war with Iran and the 4 or 5 Saudi states, plus Israel. Probably Syria is going to be in there, Lebanon. Russia may get into that mix because they have a port facility in Syria. You're going to see quite a bit of activity happening. And then 5 is where the souls under the altar are complaining that they were not revenged. That's a hint to the peace agreement. They are complaining to the Almighty that their death was not avenged. And he said, go back to sleep. It's not your time. Because he knows the peace agreement is going to be broken midway. Peace agreement is going to be for 7 years, but it would be broken towards the end of the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is 3.5 years. And the Great Tribulation starts by a meteor shower. That's seal 6. Okay, then 5 months later, they will wish death for 5 months before death comes, which is 150 days later, which is equivalent to 5 months. That's the second meteor shower. We cross the debris field 5 months away from March. That'd be at the end of August. That's really what starts the Great Tribulation. We're already in tribulation. The tribulation started in 2001, which is just Jacob's trouble. That's what tribulation means. Tribulation means trouble. Jacob's trouble started in 2001. The Great Tribulation starts with seal 6, with the meteor shower. 1/2 of the earth is going to be destroyed partially on the first meteor shower and be completely destroyed by the second meteor shower, which is 5 months later. And Wormwood is a asteroid that's in the second event. That's one of the asteroids. It's a mountain-sized asteroid that hits the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Rim, people who live on the Pacific Rim and islands and everything, even islands are going to disappear. Earth is hit so hard, it says, that Earth wobbles like a drunkard, like a hut in the wind. We're literally pushed slightly closer to the sun, and our calendar year is off. Now we have Enoch's calendar, 364-day year. One of the prophets in the Bible says that Earth is hit so hard that every wall on Earth is either cracked or crumbled globally. According to my calcs, that's greater than a magnitude 14. So the Great Tribulation is not that far away, the starting of it. It appears. And we'll have confirmation if I'm right. That's an if, because we have to have a visual verification of it, and that should come very close to February 20th. If we don't see it, then we got more time. But if you do see it, you need to be in Jerusalem, because the Messiah comes mid of night in Jerusalem. That's after a 12-hour delay in the Earth's rotation. The daylight side in March is hit by the meteor shower in March. 5 months later, at the end of August, that's a nighttime event. So the Messiah comes mid of night. That means he's on the face side of the globe. The side of the globe, if you measure 180 degrees from Jerusalem, that puts you where the center of the meteor shower is going to hit. And that half of the globe is what's going to be hit. It's going to be devastated. And people will wish death for 5 months before death comes, which is the second meteor shower 5 months later. And that will hit basically the same side, except one of them is a fiery mountain. It hits the Pacific Ocean. And that destroys the Pacific Rim. Europe will fall to Islam within a year after that. The rest of the world is Islamic except for Israel. Israel has no more allies because of this destruction.
First of all, it sounds to me like our best shot would either be to go to Jerusalem or get on the next ship that goes to Mars.
Exactly.
Because if you stay in America, if you're here at that point in time, based on what the Bible says, now we all read Revelation and we kind of say, yeah, that's, I don't want to be around that. Well, guess what? If you're on this side of the planet, and correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the planet stop its rotation when it goes through the tail, the plasma tail? And if we are stopped like it was in the biblical time for 24 hours, and this side is getting plummeted by the debris field of this thing, that to me sounds like it's a non-stop 24-hour bombardment of rocks, red dust, and who knows what else coming in.
The Bible says the event is within an hour, okay? Keep in mind, it's hitting 12 time zones simultaneously. It's still 1 hour that the event lasts, because the Bible says it lasts within, that means either equal to or shorter than an hour. That half of the earth is covered in, it's called a meteor storm is the proper name. And yes, you were saying how earth will slow down. 3 days prior to this, the tail of the comet is going to be pointing at Earth. Remember, the orbital path is slightly to the left, and the tail is pointing opposite from the sun. They're not in the same direction. So the tail of the comet, which is plasma, not ice particles, the physicists are more correct on the model of a comet than the astronomers are. Earth is starting to enter the plasma tail of the comet for 3 days. Well, that slowly slows down the rotation of Earth. By the third day, we come to a complete stop. And we lost 12 hours of rotational time. That is critical, because that changes the impact zone that the astronomers are going to announce to the public. They're going to announce the half of the globe that hit is the Middle East, Europe, Africa region and Asia. And they're not counting for a 12-hour delay. This explains the exact way that the delay happened for Joshua's long day, if you remember that story. 12 hours was added to the daylight side. I mean, remember, it's the entire earth. That means the nighttime was longer too. But it was the daylight for Joshua, and the moon was in a position where it took the impact of the meteors that saved Joshua's men, but not the enemy. The meteors only hit the enemy, it says. Well, the moon is not going to be in position for us right here because this is going to be near Passover. It'll be 3.5 days after Passover. We're looking at March 31st approximately, where the moon is at the foot of Virgo. That's a nighttime event, not a daytime event. And that puts the moon on the opposite side of Earth. Therefore, it can't shield any part that's going to be hit by the meteor shower. So you have to account for the 12-hour delay. Therefore, the side that they're going to say the impact zone is, it's going to be opposite. It's going to be North and South America. This is equivalent to the false miracle that the Antichrist does to save the Islamic countries. Rotational delay. He's going to claim that he's doing it and that he's going to change times and laws. He's going to slow down the earth by 12 hours and have fire fall on their enemies. This is already declared in the Bible that we're going to have a 12-hour delay. He's just claiming. Remember, it's a false claim. And the one that appears first is the false Messiah. Then there'll be the two witnesses that appeared 3.5 days prior to the arrival of this planet, which is probably going to be Elijah and Moses. And you'll be with them, but there's not going to be any announcement on radio or TV because once Earth is getting into the plasma tail, all generators globally have to be turned off. Anything electronically has to be turned off because it's equivalent to like an EMP, basically, as we're in the tail of this comet. So there's no TV crews, there's no radio crews announcing the two witnesses have arrived in Jerusalem. There'll be no TV or radio crews announcing the Messiah has come. You have to follow his written words. He says you to practice these rehearsal practices. They're not feasts. You can have a feast and a rehearsal, but you don't call them feasts. Okay? They are rehearsal patterns. 3 out of the 7, you are required to practice them in Jerusalem. And this is going to be the one that you need to be there. If you're not there, then you miss the appointed time and place for the Messiah that comes mid of night in Jerusalem. And he brings a remnant to the wilderness for safety. That remnant is represented as the bride and the bridemaid. The foolish bridemaids don't make it because they don't have 1 portion of oil in their lamps. The wise have 2 portions of oil because that night's going to be 12 hours longer. 1 portion gets you through 1 night of 12 hours. The wise have 2 portions. So the wise bridemaid and the bride is escorted by the Messiah to the place of safety in the wilderness where they stay 1,260 days in that place of safety. Everyone else is going through the Great Tribulation and in different phases of different parts of the world. And then there's another war towards the end of the Great Tribulation. The Antichrist and his armies will conquer the northern 3/4 of Israel before the 2 prophets die. Then they start to celebrate. Then there's another remnant that survives that's in the Negev desert. And they fall to their knees and they pray to the Father to send the Messiah. That's when the rapture happens. The second taking away, these are the guests of the wedding that are brought into the New Jerusalem that's hovering in the sky. The Antichrist is seeing us standing on a sea of glass. And then the bridemaids enter, and then the bride. The least are first and the most are last. The least knowledge is first and the most knowledge is last on entering this. And the groom is already in New Jerusalem for the rapture. He doesn't come down for the rapture. We go up to meet him. For this first taking away, the Messiah comes down as he left. And he escorts and he chooses the ones he wants to be brought to the place of safety in the wilderness. People are forgetting that there's 2 taking away. They argue as if they're 2 raptures. They're not. there's two taking aways, but only one's the rapture, and that rapture is at the end. It says all believers. The first one is taken, and it's only a remnant, and it's to the wilderness. Keep in mind, the rapture is during the daytime for everybody to see it. Okay? The first taking away, that's in the middle of the night, mid of night. And that gets you in exactly opposite of the meteor shower, which is during the daytime, 180 degrees on the earth around. That's North and South America. And remember, they have to have basically a satellite view to be able to even write this, because North and South America weren't even discovered yet during the time the Bible was written. And they're giving great details about this.
Gill, you know, the thing is, I have said for years that in order for us in America to understand properly what the Messiah said, we need to understand the culture of his day. He didn't speak in a futuristic language. He spoke to his disciples what was going on in his day. They understood exactly what he was saying. You talk about what we call the feast days. Everything was a rehearsal. Well, we know that in the fall, there are 3 yet to be fulfilled. But unless you really understand that fall feast, I mean, there's 3 of them together there in the same month, the things that take place, you incorporate the 10 virgins, you incorporate all those things spoken of from 24 on. That's all involved in those feast days. Zechariah 14 tells us that after the millennial time begins, everybody in flesh will have to go to Jerusalem once a year. Well, that's to honor he who sits on David's throne. That would be the Messiah.
He even says to Egypt, he says, because you don't go, I'm going to put drought on you.
Right.
He says that to all of Egypt right there. Yeah.
Egypt also represents the world.
Right.
So you know, he's given a warning here. And I have always said that in order for us to understand properly, we need to go back in that day. Well, what you just explained is going back into the day of the Messiah, into John, who wrote Revelation, but it's actually the vision of the Messiah that was given to John, and John wrote it the way he received it, and a lot of times it doesn't actually be in order, in a proper order, 1 through 10, so to say. We look at the events today, and if you understand the prophetic word, there is no way you can say we don't live in that time. Now, you got this comet thing coming around, and when it comes, I mean, I've seen the movies Hollywood puts out, and sometimes they do a fairly good example of it. Greenland, the one that just...
combine 3 movies. I think it's called The Day After, and the movie called 2012, and Greenland.
Yeah.
If you combine those 3 movies together, you still don't have it all yet, but that gets close, because it doesn't give you the reference on how Earth is going to react when it's in the tail of the plasma, and it slows down its rotation and everything. But if you put those 3, you're going to get very close to what to expect.
Okay, so let me ask a question. There are those that are probably thinking this. If we're supposed to go to Jerusalem for safety, is everybody supposed to pack up? They probably won't let you fly over or take one of the cruise lines over. So how are we supposed to get there?
Remember, the Israelite slaves in Egypt, they were poor, they had no money, they had no way of travel, they were held back. But God made a way, didn't he? Remember when it was time to leave, that they had to go and ask for the gold. They weren't stealing from the Egyptians. They were just asking back Joseph's gold. Remember, way back when it was Joseph for the drought, the only 2 people that owned anything was the Pharaoh and Joseph. Everyone else had to sell everything they had to get grain. They sold their cattle because they didn't have pastures to feed them, so they had to sell the cattle to trade it for grain. Pharaoh ended up owning all the land and all the cattle, and the cattle were given to the Hebrews to maintain, to be herdsmen, shepherds of the cattle, and that was considered a very low-level job. But guess what? During the time of drought, that's a very high-ranking job when there's no food. So Pharaoh liked Joseph for what he had managed the whole crisis situation. Remember, like I was telling you, how they turn over the power to someone else during these crises? Well, the Pharaoh turned over the power to Joseph to manage this crisis on getting the grain stored up and to prepare it and everything. If it would have went wrong, it would have been Joseph's fault. The Pharaoh would have passed it on to him. So Joseph ended up with either 15 to 20% of all the wealth of Egypt. You remember, the following king after that Pharaoh had died, the next Pharaoh or two, they had a broken economy. None of the Egyptians had land or money. So they're on welfare to a certain extent, or they're working for the Hebrews. The Hebrews, they have the money to buy the grain, and so they're contracting the people to farm the land. So eventually, one of the pharaohs say, well, let's change this. Let's take the wealth from the Hebrews, give it to the Egyptians, let the Hebrews be the workers, okay? So when they went to leave, the only thing they had to do was ask for what was theirs. That was Joseph's gold and silver. Remember, they were making bricks without straw. Many people today are having 2 to 3 jobs, and it gets them only to break even. Today, we are making bricks without straw. There's no gain in it. You see? This is going to be turning around for the ones that want to make it to Jerusalem. And this is not for everybody. That's why a lot of people say, well, for all believers. That's not what the text says. This is for ones who are following his laws and his feast days, if we want to call it. But they're actually his appointed time days and practices. When you're following his appointed days and practices, you're going to be in the right place at the right time automatically. And you're going to get a blessing, financial blessing coming. So you're going to see a lot of debts being vanquished. You're going to see financial blessings. But what you do with it is whether or not you're going to make it through this or not. So this is where there's each stories of the Bible, certain ones of the Bible, that it's a shadow picture of present time. It's mirroring. There's multiple aspects to this. And there's only one entity in the universe that can do that, which is the Almighty, that was able to create these stories where it mirrors the last book of the Bible. So I point out multiple places where this planet has come around. There's different points, like Job, the 40-day warning, the double eclipse. A double eclipse is mentioned multiple times in the Bible. It talks about the sun being darkened and the moon blood red. That's a double eclipse. You can't have a double eclipse in the natural. It takes a third object, like Yeshua's sacrifice. We have outside text that says the moon was blood red and the sun went dark for 3 hours. Well, if it's a normal eclipse, the moon can only give you 7.3 minutes of darkness because the earth will rotate out of the shadow. And the text clearly says the whole earth is darkened. Well, a normal eclipse doesn't give you the whole earth. It only gives you a small region. Okay? This is Passover, near the time of Passover. Well, the moon's on the opposite side of Earth. It's not involved with the sun. It can't be in front of the sun if it's on the opposite side. So it automatically qualifies a third object there. And you had a double eclipse. Same thing in Joseph's time, same thing. Multiple times it's mentioned, but people who don't know enough astronomy, they just glance over it. They don't pick up on it. We have artifacts that shows us that it was around. It shows us that Earth tilted 26 to 28 degrees. That's going to happen again. Earth is going to tilt 26 to 28 degrees. You're looking at major flooding in the northern poles and southern poles when Earth comes to a stop on its axis. And then when the two planets get close together, opposite poles attract, they tilt 26 to 28 degrees. Then there's plasma strikes from the two planets. It's like a capacitor. When they get close to each other, there's basically a lightning bolt. that goes from one planet to the other. This lightning bolt is 30 miles across. How do we know that? Because we have craters that the plasma has already hit on Earth. You can look at one in Africa. It's called the Eye of the Sahara. The flat crater, not concave, has multiple rims in the center. That's a helical coil of a lightning bolt that's turning like a tornado. This also regenerates our magnetic field of Earth, being hit by a plasma bolt, just like a magnet. If a magnet is hit by a lightning bolt, the polarity switches from the north to south switches. Same thing that's going to happen to Earth. Every plasma hit that Earth is going to hit, Earth's magnetic field is going to swap again. It's going to swap several times within this passing. But Earth does not flip on its axis. No, it only tilts 26 to 28 degrees. And when it comes back, it will be 4 to 7 degrees off from its normal position on where the North Pole is. Right now, according to calcs, we're looking at the North Pole to be somewhere between Greenland and Canada, somewhere around there. The Arctic Circle temporarily will come all the way down to around Washington, D.C., kind of like in the movies. How did they know that? Yeah. You're looking at winds anywhere from 200 to 300 mile-an-hour winds. If you're 90 degrees from Jerusalem, that's the maximum wind. But if you segment it out, you get less and less winds from that point. This is going to be the worst event in all of Earth's history. Noah's flood is not the worst. The Bible says this next event is.
Thank you, Justice Waters. And Gill, it's been a very interesting discussion here. Gill, do you have any final words for the American people as we close?
When you get a blessing, remember, like Sukkot, it has you practicing how to build a temporary shelter. The government cannot support everybody being a refugee globally for a while. Remember, every wall on Earth is cracked. Don't count on your utilities working. It'll take a while before they repair them. Your structure that you're living in may not be safe to live in. Get a secondary structure. Tents, camping stoves, sleeping bags, cots, these type of things, because you can't depend on the government. That's why the Almighty has you practice the code. It's not a vain religious act. It's factual. He's getting you conditioned to know how to live in a temporary setting, in a refugee-type setting. The Bible tells us to be watchmen, not to be prophets on the wall, not to be critics on the wall, to be a watchman on the wall. We will not know for sure until we see it with our own eyes as it rounds the sun. It'll be near the 40-day warning, whether it's this year, next year, whatever. But right now, this is the 20 years that's mentioned in Jacob. It gives me great concern because of everything we've seen since March. We've seen 2, 3, 4, and 5 start, and it should be completed by this next March. You know, it gives me great concern. Pay attention to the skies. Look near the sun is setting, and at one point you're going to see the tail stretch almost across the sky. It's going to be the largest comet that you've ever seen. And that's about all I can tell people.
Thank you, Gill.
The Lord showed me some time ago in Ecclesiastes 1:9. It says something very simple but so powerful, and it's actually one of the laws that God himself follows. What has happened once will happen again. The thing that has happened is the same thing that will happen again. There's nothing new under the sun. And what you are explaining that has already happened before is about to happen again. And it's not the second time. It may be like the 15th or 16th time.
I have it documented 14 times in the biblical record from Noah's flood to Yeshua's time, and then another 5 after that in secular time. And the information prior to the flood is sketchy, but I can estimate maybe another 5 there even. Yes, this is multiple times. He has different reasons for using it for different times. And this is going to be a different time right here. This is the end days, and this is only for the remnant. That word is the scariest word in the Bible. It's the word remnant. And it's the one that shows up and followed his feet.
It's interesting to me that there are certain words that is used that, like you say, are scary. If is the biggest word in the Bible. therefore is a word you don't want to hear about because you're supposed to do one thing, but you did something else. So therefore, and remnant, like you say, if you are a Bible student, you should know these things. And unfortunately, in America, the vast majority of people go to a church on a non-Sabbath day. They don't really hear the word. They hear a good sermonette that makes them feel good. And they walk out and say, well, we had church today, when in reality, you had a game show.
What is that passage? I don't quite remember it exactly, but where it says they're in shock and they're saying that all our traditions and teachings are false or something like that. How did it say that?
I've heard it before.
It's a clear warning to Christians, basically, what it's talking about. Jews and Christians and Islam and so on, that all of these vain religious acts were false, basically, and that they were taught vain things.
Well, I do know that in Jeremiah 14, it makes a comment that Jeremiah goes before the Lord, and he says, Lord, the prophets are saying that there's not going to be any sword or any war or any trouble. And the Lord speaks back to Jeremiah and says, that's not me. I never told him that. Matter of fact, it's going to be so bad, there won't be enough living to bury the dead. And that's what we have today in America. We have people who claim to be voices for the Lord who are not giving correct information out. And the flocks are following them. And they're going to be destroyed because it's not a lack of knowledge. They don't have any knowledge at all compared to what they should have. Here I am, I'm pushing 70. I would think that in all my years I should have enough knowledge to understand certain things that I really need to understand, especially in the prophetic viewpoint. And, you know, the Lord has opened up and showed me things, but that's only because I have been willing to listen. And a lot of people, unfortunately, they want to hear what they want to hear. They don't want to hear what the Lord has to say. And that there's a big difference there. And I've always asked the people this. You say you know him. The real question is, does he know you? To me, that's the scariest question to ask.
1 John chapter 2, verse 4 says, whoever says, I know him, but does not follow his commandment is a liar. And
right.
The truth is not in him. Remember, Paul, he was trained in the laws of the Pharisees, which is all of the laws. Many people are missing the fact that what he's talking about laws right there is the rabbinical laws that are in the Talmud, not the laws of Moses. There were two laws. And he was condemning the laws of the Talmud that the rabbis were forcing on the people. And just like John is saying, if they say now he's talking about the laws of Moses right here, the ones who are giving, you know, that does not keep his commandments and is a liar and doesn't have the truth. And it's hard for people to come to the record. It's easy to fool people. It's hard for people to understand that they've been fooled. They won't accept that. It takes much, much longer.
Gill, do you have another final comment?
I would say, just like the Bible says, pray that you are chosen and pray that you can make it to Jerusalem, because the Messiah doesn't show up in New York City or Paris. He shows up in Jerusalem. Remember where it says that the two prophets were laid dead in the streets for 3.5 days? I'm not quite sure if that's the only half that I know that talks about time. That half brings you from daylight to nighttime, okay? And if the two prophets are dead for 3.5, and for the whole earth to see the rapture, basically there, that's during the daytime side, and the Messiah comes mid of night, okay? That's why you have to have that half right there to bring it from mid of night to mid of day. And if you want to know how long the prophets were on earth, add the 3.5 days to the 1,260 days. People forget to add that. That means the two prophets are in Jerusalem 3.5 days before the Messiah arrived and before we're led into the wilderness. Now it lines up to where we're raptured at the same day, the people in the wilderness as well as the people on earth as, let me say, believers. People forget about those 3.5 days. People are not using math properly. Wake up, people. You got very little time to catch up to this. Perhaps many will be deceived. The road is wide. Religion is very wide. And you should be grabbing onto this as a way of life, not as a way of religion. You're supposed to be doing it as a way of life. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Gill. Well, everybody has a lot to think about here and a lot to digest. I want to give everybody time to digest it, and then maybe we'll make another update before too much longer. And meanwhile, if you didn't get in on the original appearance of Gill here on the Republic News Network, then look back at a previous date. I'll put that link down below when we publish this YouTube, so you'll have that. But that's going to give you an overview of the planet's orbit and all that kind of detailed information that you may have questions about.
You can put a link to the free PDF book as well.
Yes, sir, I will. So thank you all for listening, and God bless America.